Hello, I'm Brett Knowles from PM Squared Consulting. This is meant to be the definitive guide about the difference between OKRs and KPIs. And I'll just be harvesting the best practices and common practices to put this forward. Now, why am I doing this? Well, if you Google OKRs versus KPIs, you get about 150 really solid articles, blog posts, papers, and so on. The dilemma is when I look at those, they seem to be biased, right? They seem to be biased based on the author's vantage point. They work for a software vendor, they have a particular methodology, and so they twist the definitions of OKRs and KPIs around to suit the solution that they seem to be progressing. Secondly, there's a lot of opinions there. There aren't definitive rules, and people tend to use their opinions as being a definitive rule, and I think that's wrong. And then finally, just personal opinions. People are voicing what they think. Now, I don't mean to put those down. It's all interesting conversation perspective, but it makes it very confusing to try to sort out what is an OKR, what's a KPI. And so what I want to do is do the best I can to provide you with just the facts. My caveats are along the following lines. First, there is no legislated rule about what is an OKR or what is a KPI. So I can't go to any one book and say, here it is, here's the answer. But there is a collection of best practices and common practices that are associated with OKRs and a different set which are associated with KPIs. And so that's the distinction I'm going to try to make. And how am I going to make it is, again, for the purposes of this analysis, the ideas that we have seen come into common use over the last 5 years, in particular in association with OKRs. So again, to loop back, both in the last 5 years, which your KPIs have been around for a long time. So in the last 5 years, there's another catalyst, obviously OKRs. And secondly, when we see them in use associated with OKRs or elements which are covered in John Doerr's book, Measure What Matters. Now, I'm not saying John Doerr's book is a definitive book, but it does seem to be the rallying point for most OKR practitioners. So I'll use those two elements as my filters. Then what I've done is I've tried to group the ideas into two categories. One is what things are core OKR. These are attributes that are new and explicitly identified in Measure What Matters, associated with OKRs. And then secondly, things which are KPI unique, which are either specifically excluded from the OKR practice or just unique to the KPI areas and not overlapping. So let's start off with core OKR. And what I've done is just, put two columns. What's the element as seen by OKRs? What's the element as seen by KPIs? So the first example would be in the OKR world, key results are explicitly linked to strategic goals, right? So you set an objective, a strategic objective or goal, and then I link the KR specifically to it. And whereas with a KPI, they link to the process. Now, the issue here is that process may or may not be strategically important. So, I'll use the metaphor of, say, a car driving along. I've got gas gauges, speedometers, check engine lights, all those things. Now, as a KPI, you have no idea what's more important, the fuel gauge, the speedometer, the check engine light. But if in the OKR world, once I understand the strategy, so let's say I'm driving along and the oil light goes on or check engine, you're supposed to pull over the side and, call a tow truck. But that's only appropriate if your strategy is going to the office or going on a scenic tour. If, on the other hand, you're driving to the hospital in an emergency and the check engine light goes on, you keep on going. In other words, by understanding the strategy, we know how to interpret the key result. So OKRs are linked to strategy. Once I understand my company's strategy, if it's to attract new customers, then those key results become linked to it, or the key results linked to it become more important than those, for example, associated with entering new markets. In the KPI world, I don't know which I should be paying attention to. Or, I don't know, let's say you're driving day to day. I don't worry about my gas level because there's gas stations at every corner. But if my strategy is to drive through the desert where there aren't gas stations, then the gas gauge becomes the most important measure. Again, Linking to strategy puts the key result into strategic context and hence is way more important to us in organizations. That's how we work. What's an OKR? What is a KPI equivalent? So another example would be OKRs. The whole idea is that more rapid drumbeat, refresh once a quarter. Now, there's no rule to say you can't update your KPIs once a quarter, but common practice, right? They're normally linked to that annual planning process and have been, since the mid 80s when I started working with them. So the cadence issue becomes different. And again, it's more appropriate. OKRs, we've got a faster drumbeat in our businesses these days. A faster drumbeat and refreshing them is appropriate. Next, OKRs have explicit owners, right? We associate it with an individual or a team or department. Whereas with a KPI, there is no formal ownership, right? So if I'm back to my example of I need to attract more customers, I'm going to assign that to a sales team or a sales individual. Whereas number of new customers as a KPI doesn't have an owner. And again, ownership allows people to understand their purpose, why they're in the organization, what they're supposed to do, and what their measure of success is. So they drive employee engagement, whereas, of course, the KPI doesn't have that attribute. OKRs an objective can use multiple key results. In other words, I've got an objective like, attract new customers. I can have 2 or 3 key results that attribute to it. And maybe some of those are associated with marketing, some are operations. In other words, the metrics, the key results in an OKR allow you to show the cross-functional nature of work. KPIs, on the other hand, are single focus, right? They're looking at dollar sales or marketing activity or operations, and they don't reflect the cross-functional nature of work. Again, this allows us to collaborate as teams better and make sure as a team we progress towards those strategic objectives. OKRs can include project key results. Now, typically those are by milestone, right? By quarter 1, I expect to have this milestone and that milestone completed. Or sometimes people make them binary. Did I achieve that milestone? Whereas KPIs do not include any aspect of project delivery or even completion. Those are used by the project team and you look at in your PMO model, but I don't have a KPI on a project. Objectives change over time as the strategy evolves, right? That quarterly check-in about strategy, about our OKRs, allow us to update that strategy, technically 4 times a year, whereas KPIs remain constant over time. Now, this part becomes super important, especially this year with COVID. The whole idea is you basically had one strategy in January. When COVID hit in March, we had another strategy. We called that survival. And then when April rolled around, we had a different strategy. We called that the new normal. And then when June rolled around, we had another new strategy called the next normal, and so forth. That organization typically has like 4 strategy iterations where before we would have not even had one. And so the idea is as the objectives change over time, so do the key results. So it makes it a learning organization. It makes it agile, allows it to adapt with the environment. Whereas the KPI is the same. I'm always measuring my fuel level, whether I'm driving through the desert or driving through the city. OKRs are designed to focus our attention and focus our activity, right? They're very specifically, they're looking at what are the important things we need to focus on. Whereas KPIs are designed to cover all aspects of the organization, regardless of their importance. And this becomes really important because where do we insert our creative juices? Well, in OKRs, we know exactly where we should be focusing our creative juices and any surplus time and resources we have. Whereas a KPI, everyone chooses their own area. And that causes a huge production drag or productivity drag as different people focus on different things and we don't actually rally around any one particular issue. OKRs are about transparency, right? The ability to see all the objectives and all the key results and all the performance. Whereas KPIs typically are deployed in an area-specific dashboard and only people in that area have access to it. So, I don't know, let's use a different metaphor. Let's pretend that we're playing soccer, football. I need to be able to, if I'm playing forward, I need to be able to see what the midfield is doing, what defense is doing, what goalie's doing, and I need to know what their purpose is. I need to know what defense is supposed to do, and then I can see whether they're actually doing that or not, and then I can decide how I'm going to play my position as a forward. Maybe if defense is weak, I'm going to have to spend more time back. If defense is strong, I can be more aggressive. And so the same happens in an organization. We need transparency to see all the team's objectives, what their key results are and how they're performing, so we can make decisions about how it impacts us. If they're late on a linked key result, then I better adjust my expectations because I'm not going to deliver. If they're coming early, I better change my objective or key result to react to that. In the KPI world, it's invisible. I have no idea what's happening in the processes before mine or after mine, and so I just operate in that vacuum. Now, OKRs are designed so that they're easy to understand, and it's a common reporting format across the organization. I don't care, what tool you're using. An OKR in sales is reported the same way as it's reported in marketing, as in operations, as in finance. So it makes it really super easy to understand what's happening in any department. Whereas dashboards and KPIs, gosh, you need a PhD in graphology. What happens is each dashboard ends up being produced differently. Only process experts can understand what that graph is telling us. I mean, are high values good or bad for that metric? And only then can they interpret the performance. It's a bit like looking at a spaceship, dashboard. There's so many dials and stuff on it that, mere humans have no idea how to interpret that. But if you're an astronaut and you've been through 10 years of training, easy peasy lemon squeezy. So again, KPIs tend to be in dashboards, process specific, and if you're not a Jedi Knight in that area, you can't hope to understand them. Now, again, this isn't meant to be anything other than where common practices or best practices are, or what Measure What Matters has professed. Now, I'm going to go to the flip side. There's things that are specific to KPIs which are not specifically not included in OKRs. So let's take a look at that. So the example would be OKRs explicitly do not cover compensation. Now, we argue they should be used in CFR conversations, but they're also not designed to address valuation or calibration, regulation, and so forth. Whereas KPIs are. KPIs cover the domains of valuation. They help us value the business. Navigation, they help us navigate the business, as do OKRs. KPIs help us with compensation. They're specifically included as SMART measures in the compensation model. They support us in calibration or benchmarking, as I benchmark myself against other organizations. They support me in communications when I have an all-hands meeting or I'm talking to stockbrokers or shareholders. And then finally, regulation. KPIs support the regulatory requirements we need. So again, KPIs support valuation, navigation, compensation, calibration, communication, and regulation. Whereas OKRs only really cover valuation. They explicitly do not cover compensation and generally don't give you much benchmarking data, calibration, may or may not be a component of communication, and seldom are part of regulation. The second difference is OKRs are specific about outcomes. And so in the KPI world, they're considered to be lagging. What is the outcome that we're looking for? Whereas KPIs can be both leading and lagging. Now, there's benefits to leading KPIs, right? If I know how I'm doing in my leading KPI, I can better predict what I'm going to do in my process. So there are advantages to KPIs in some instances. OKRs tend to be focused on outcomes because they're trying to say, what do we have more of or less of as I move towards that objective? So I hope this has been useful to you as a comparison and, what I would argue is a more definitive guide as to what OKRs are versus KPIs and the difference between the two. You can be the judge of what's best for your organization. It's important to note that, as I said, my caveat to the beginning, there is no legislation that says an OKR is this way and a KPI is that way. I'm using best practices. I'm using Measure What Matters books and just what we see in the thousands of clients that we've worked with. But what this means is even if you don't have an OKR system, you can include some of those OKR attributes in your KPIs. Or if you're dogmatic about using OKRs, there are elements of KPIs you might want to consider including in your OKR structure. Again, there's no rules to say you can't do that. So I hope this has been useful to you. I've enjoyed thinking this through and producing this for your information.